All right, so previously I covered my expanding abbreviations in Z shell, fish shell, and using auto hotkey, but I did not go over how to do this with PowerShell. So I want to take a minute and step through that. And so as a first step, before I worry about this repo where you can get the code, if I come over to the command line here, if I do something like GST here in space, you can see it expands into get status. And so I use these so I don't have to type out long commands. For example, maybe DCPSA space that turns into Docker container ps-a or DCRI. This is a different alias that I use. So I refer to this as an expanding alias, or in fish shell, this is referred to as an abbreviation. In both cases, these expand before you actually run the command, so you can see what exactly you're going to run. All right, now to define one of these, if I use the ealias function I defined, I could type foo, that's the name or the alias, and then bar, 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 or whatever I'd like. Once I do that, now if I type foo and hit space, that's replaced with bar, bar, bar. So whatever I defined for an alias. So it's pretty easy to work with. And if you'd like to get your hands on a copy of this, that's where this repo comes in. I've got this published out to the PowerShell gallery as just ABBR, just like the fish shell has an ABBR helper function, same idea. So essentially you can install this here and you can import it if you want. You don't have to though, because once you define a very first alias, the module will be loaded if it's not already loaded, and you'll be off to the races. And then if you're curious about the implementation here, I have another copy of this out in my .files repo. So I split out a brand new repo, that PowerShell-ABBR repo, that'll just have that one module that I published to PowerShell Gallery. But I also have another copy of this, a private copy, if you will, that I keep inside of my .files repo. You can also get to that, that's public. And so in this copy right now, the two versions are the same because I just set up that new repo and copied it over. So this is my private copy, and over time, this will probably drift because I'll put changes here, and only rarely will it update the other repo. I want that one to be stable. So if you want to understand what exactly is going on behind the scenes here, these are some of the functions that are used. For example, here is the ealias function, and it actually has some parameters to it. For example, no space after, which is an option I use. If I do GST and hit space, you can see there's a space after status because I put a space in. Naturally, I want to add my next argument here or my next flag. Well, there are some commands where I don't want to do that. For example, if I'm going to type out a get commit message, gcmsg, hit a space here, and now I've got the prompt right after the double quote, so I can put in whatever message, close that off. And so if I had added a space after the end of this, then it would be something like this, and that would look unnatural in terms of the commit message. And so that's why I defined an option to say, hey, when you expand this, don't add that last space after the last part of the expansion. And then there's also an option to specify if you want one of these to expand anywhere. For example, if I use GST here and hit space, that expands. However, if I do echo GST and hit space, you can see that doesn't expand. Basically, I only want most of these to expand in the command position, but there are a few where I want them to expand anywhere. For example, if I did something like a kubectl get pods, and I have a YAML format on that, in this case, I might want to pipe it to a command that'll add syntax highlighting. So I have a few abbreviations set up like p YAML. When I hit space here, this expands out. It pipes the data to the back command, which can then syntax highlight it. So there are a couple of cases where I have an alias set up where I want this to expand anywhere. But for the vast majority of the aliases, I don't want them to expand anywhere. And so that's why there's an option here called anywhere. You can set this to true, and then that alias will expand anywhere. So that's the heart of registering or defining an alias. And then inside of here, basically, I capture the arguments and the parameters you passed, and I store that by the name of the alias like GST. So I can look that up later on then. That's in a hash. And then up above, I have an alias for ABBR. That way I can copy some of my definitions from fish shell and use them verbatim in PowerShell. It's just a wrapper around ealias, and it only takes 2 arguments. So none of these additional arguments will be passed then. And then up above here, I have a method to look up that metadata, the args that were passed. So none of this is critical. It's just how I look up one of the ealiases when expansion's happening. And speaking of when expansion's happening, if I come down below here, I've got a function, expand alias before cursor. So when you hit the space key, actually, let's come down below here. Here is my PS readline key handler. And when you hit the space key, this is what fires, and it calls that function that we just looked at up above. So you hit the space, this fires. This function then, if I come up above here, I get the buffer state, which reads the command line. So if I have GST here and I hit space, GST is what's going to come back when I read the buffer. That's the current command that I've entered. Then I take that and I go through the tokens inside of there, and I decide if anything needs to be expanded by looking up the metadata for the arguments. Then I have some logic to decide when to do what, whether or not to add a space, whether or not to expand if it's in the middle of a command or only at the command position or start of a command. Got all that logic here. And then at the end of the day, the heart of this is it modifies the command line to inject whatever it is that you want to expand to. So I'm just rewriting what the user typed. And that's it. That's the heart of it. And then there's actually one more method down below or function down below, which is this function right here. So there's an edge case here. If I type out GST and I hit return without a space, I also want that to expand. So that's a separate edge case that I have to deal with. And so that's what this second function is for. So if you hit enter instead of space, in this case, I set this up as a command validation handler. So before the command is run, this will be executed and it'll check and see, is whatever command was run, is that actually an alias? And if it is, then go ahead and expand it. And once again, it's just replacing the command and modifying it before the command is actually run. And then once it's run here, you can see it actually replaced GST with get status. So that's what actually gets executed. And then I'm registering that validation handler here. And then that's it. This part down below, this is actually not pertinent to the discussion. This is a separate little handler I've set up. So yeah, that's the bulk of the implementation. And this is for PowerShell. And if you want to find examples of these aliases, if you come over to my dot files, for example, for Git, here are a bunch that I've defined for Git. GST should be in here somewhere. I also have GRV for listing remotes, and I've got various options for Git add. And then for other commands like Docker, I've got these set up. And then in addition to the ones that are actually in PowerShell files, I also have some that are specific to Fish Shell or Z Shell because that's the only place I've set them up. So you could refer to the same files over in Z Shell, for example. If I scroll down here, close some of this. Here, for example, are my Git aliases in Z Shell. Or perhaps more interesting, if I look up MISC and Fish, I've got a lot of them in here. And so inside of here, you can see I have systemd aliases if you're working in Linux. Also got containerd, and I've got various other commands embedded inside of here. The bulk of my time I spend inside of Fish Shell, so that's where you're going to find the bulk of the abbreviations. And then, like I said, I've got that wrapper ABBR, where you can just pick this up, copy it over, and dump it into PowerShell, and it'll work verbatim as is. So I could just copy this, for example, come down to the bottom of this file, just paste that in, save that. Over at the command line, make a new tab here, reload my startup files. And what was that again? It was K3S. And there you go. That expands out to sudo K3S.